The airplane was buzzing with activity as passengers settled into their seats, some scrolling through their phones, others flipping through in-flight magazines or chatting quietly with their seatmates. It was a normal boarding process, at least. That's what it seemed like. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, checking seatbelts, closing overhead bins, and ensuring that everything was in order for takeoff. Among the passengers in first class, two young boys, Jaden and his younger brother Malik, sat side by side in plush leather seats, their excitement barely contained. They had never flown first class before. Their father, Desmond Carter, had surprised them with these tickets as a reward for their excellent grades. It was a treat, one they weren't expecting, but were more than happy to accept. Jaden, the older brother, had a composed nature. He always looked after Malik, who had an endless supply of energy. As the younger boy eagerly explored the in-flight entertainment screen, Jaden leaned back, appreciating the extra space and comfort of their seats. He knew their father worked hard, and this was his way of rewarding them. "This is crazy," Malik whispered, his fingers tapping at the screen, scrolling through movie options. "We've never had seats this big before," Jaden smirked, adjusting his armrest. "Yeah, well, we earned it." Just as he was about to put on his headphones, a shadow loomed over them. A tall woman in a perfectly pressed uniform stood beside their seats, arms crossed. Her name tag read Miss Vanessa Holloway. She had been a flight attendant for nearly 15 years, a veteran in the airline industry. Efficiency was her priority. She prided herself on keeping things in order, ensuring that flights ran smoothly. She wasn't the type to smile unnecessarily, but she was known for her strict adherence to airline policies. Now, however, her expression was unreadable. Her gaze flickered between Jaden and Malik before she finally spoke, her tone professional yet unmistakably firm. "Excuse me, boys," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Are you sure you're in the right seats?" Jaden looked up, confused. "Yes. We have first-class tickets." Miss Holloway pursed her lips. Her eyes darted toward the empty seat next to them, as if expecting a parent or guardian to be present. "Where are your parents?" she asked. Malik blinked. "We're traveling alone." Vanessa's lips pressed together in a thin line. Something about the way she looked at them made Jaden's stomach twist. He had seen that expression before. Doubt, skepticism, judgment. He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out his boarding pass, handing it to her. Malik did the same. Miss Holloway took the tickets, holding them between her fingers for longer than necessary. She glanced at them, flipped them over, inspected them as though she expected to find something wrong. The tickets were legitimate, yet she hesitated. After a few seconds, she handed them back, though something in her eyes remained unconvinced. "I'll be right back," she said, her voice clipped before she turned on her heel and walked toward the front of the cabin. Jaden watched her go, his jaw tightening. "That was weird," he muttered under his breath. Malik, who had stopped playing with the in-flight screen, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Why do I feel like she doesn't believe us?" Jaden didn't answer. He didn't want to admit that he felt the same way. Across the aisle, a businessman adjusted his tie, pretending not to notice what had just happened. A woman in seat 3D glanced at the boys briefly before looking away, as if unsure whether she should say something. The atmosphere in first class, which had felt warm and inviting just moments ago, suddenly felt colder. Minutes later, Ms. Holloway returned, but this time, she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by another flight attendant, Mr. Bennett, the senior crew member for this flight. He was older, with salt and pepper hair, and carried an air of quiet authority. His presence made Jaden sit up straighter. Ms. Holloway's voice was louder now, drawing more attention. "We need you both to come with us," she said. Jaden tensed. "Why? What's wrong?" "There's been a mistake with your seating," she replied, already impatient. "You need to move." Malik's face fell. "But we have first-class tickets," he repeated, his voice smaller this time. Mr. Bennett cleared his throat. "Boys, let's not make this difficult." Jaden clenched his fists. He knew arguing wouldn't help. He inhaled deeply and grabbed his backpack. Malik hesitated, but followed his brother's lead. As they stood, the entire cabin went silent. People watched but said nothing. Some passengers avoided eye contact. Others stole glances but quickly returned to their magazines or phones. It was as if they sensed something was wrong but didn't want to get involved. Miss Holloway led the two boys down the aisle, toward the exit. Jaden and Malik walked past row after row of passengers, feeling every stare. The moment they stepped off the plane, a member of the airline ground staff, Ms. Lydia Patel, was waiting for them. "Step aside, please," she said, motioning toward a nearby seating area near the gate. The second they were off the plane, Malik pulled out his phone, his fingers shaky as he typed a message. "Malik, they made us leave our seats. They said there was a mistake, but we had our tickets." He hit send, his stomach twisting. A reply came almost instantly. "Dad, what flight number?" Jaden read the message over his brother's shoulder and exhaled slowly. "He's gonna be mad," he muttered. Malik nodded, really mad. Jaden Carter adjusted the straps on his backpack as he walked briskly through the crowded airport terminal, his younger brother Malik trailing behind him, nearly bouncing with excitement. They were traveling alone for the first time, a big milestone for both of them, but what made this trip even more special was that they were flying, first class. Their father, Desmond Carter, a highly respected businessman, had surprised them with the tickets as a reward for their hard work in school. It wasn't just a gift, it was a statement. They belonged here. At 15 years old, Jaden was the older and more composed of the two. He had always taken on the role of the responsible older brother, watching over 13-year-old Malik, who had a boundless energy that never seemed to run out. Jaden had learned early on that his younger brother's excitement could sometimes lead to trouble, so he always kept a watchful eye on him. "This place is huge," Malik whispered as they approached their gate, his wide eyes scanning the massive terminal. "Do you think they'll have those warm towels in first class?" Jaden chuckled. "Probably." "And unlimited snacks," Jaden smirked. "I think that's the whole point." Their journey so far had been smooth. When they arrived at the check-in counter, the airline staff had been nothing but polite, scanning their tickets and confirming their unaccompanied minor status without any issue. They even received priority boarding. Everything felt right, but that would change soon. As they stepped onto the plane, the difference between economy and first class was immediately noticeable. The spacious leather seats, the quiet, calming atmosphere, and the attentive flight attendants created an entirely different world, one that they weren't used to, but were excited to experience. Jaden checked their seat numbers, 2A and 2 billions, window and aisle, perfect seats. He led Malik down the aisle, and the two brothers settled in. "Yo, this seat is like a mini couch," Malik whispered excitedly, already playing with the in-flight entertainment screen. Jaden rolled his eyes, but he couldn't deny that this was a special moment. He leaned back into his seat, sighing in relief. Their father had always taught them that hard work led to reward, and today was proof of that. The cabin slowly filled as more first-class passengers boarded. Jaden took a moment to observe his surroundings. There was an older gentleman reading a newspaper in 1A, a businesswoman typing away on her laptop in 3 Celsiuses, and a couple chatting softly near the back of the first-class section. Everything felt normal, until it didn't. As Jaden adjusted his armrest, a flight attendant appeared beside them. She was tall, well-groomed, with sharp, calculating eyes. Her name tag read Vanessa Holloway. She didn't smile. "Excuse me, boys," she said, crossing her arms. "Are you sure you're in the right seats?" Jaden frowned. "Yes, we have first-class tickets." Miss Holloway's lips pressed together in a thin line. "Where are your parents?" she asked. Malik blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "We're traveling alone," he answered. For a moment there was silence. Jaden could feel it, the hesitation in her eyes, the unspoken doubt. He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out his boarding pass, handing it to her. Malik did the same. Miss Holloway took the tickets and stared at them for far too long. She flipped them over, inspected them again, as if expecting to find a mistake. But the tickets were real. Yet her expression remained skeptical. She handed them back but didn't step away. Instead, her voice was firmer. "I'll be right back," she said before turning and walking toward the front of the plane. Jaden watched her go, his jaw tightening. Something felt off. "That was weird," he muttered under his breath. Malik shrugged, but Jaden could tell he felt it too. Passengers around them had noticed the interaction. Some exchanged glances, others pretended not to listen. A woman in seat 3D, dressed in a navy blue blazer, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The first-class cabin, which had felt inviting just moments ago, suddenly felt different. Jaden tapped his fingers against the armrest. He had a sinking feeling that things were about to go very wrong, and he was right, because when Miss Holloway returned a few minutes later, she wasn't alone. She brought another flight attendant with her, Mr. Bennett, a senior crew member. Jaden immediately sat up straighter. Something about their posture, about the way they looked at him and Malik, told him exactly what was about to happen. And he didn't like it. "We need you both to come with us," Miss Holloway said, louder this time. Jaden's fingers tightened around the armrest. "Why?" Her tone sharpened. "There's been a mistake with your seating. You need to move." Malik's face fell. "But we have first-class tickets," he said, his voice smaller this time. Mr. Bennett cleared his throat. "Boys, let's not make this difficult." Jaden inhaled deeply. He knew arguing wouldn't help. With a slow breath, he grabbed his backpack. Malik hesitated but followed his brother's lead. As they stood, the energy in the cabin shifted. Passengers watched but said nothing. Some turned away. Others stole glances. No one spoke up. Miss Holloway led them toward the exit. Jaden felt every stare. The second they stepped off the plane, a ground staff member, Lydia Patel, was already waiting. "Step aside, please," she said, motioning toward a nearby seating area near the gate. The moment they sat down, Malik pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking. "Malik, they made us leave our seats. They said there was a mistake, but we had our tickets." He hit send, his stomach twisting. A reply came almost instantly. "Dad, what flight number?" Jaden exhaled slowly. He read the message over Malik's shoulder. "He's gonna be mad," he muttered. Malik nodded. "Really mad." Jaden Carter sat stiffly in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest as he replayed the last few minutes in his mind. Something felt off. It wasn't the normal check-in process or a simple ticket verification. It was the way she looked at them. Across the aisle, Malik shifted in his seat, fidgeting with his phone. "Why do I feel like she doesn't believe us?" he muttered under his breath. Jaden glanced toward the front of the plane, where Vanessa Holloway, the flight attendant, had disappeared after examining their tickets. She hadn't looked satisfied. Passengers around them continued settling in, the hum of quiet conversations filling the cabin. A businessman across from them adjusted his tie and flipped open a newspaper. A woman in seat 3D, dressed in a navy blue blazer, glanced toward them briefly before looking away. The atmosphere in first class should have been calm and welcoming, but now it felt tense, heavy with unspoken questions. Jaden could feel the shift, the way people around them noticed the interaction but chose to say nothing. A few minutes later, Miss Holloway returned, this time with another flight attendant, Mr. Bennett, the senior crew member. He had a commanding presence, older, with graying hair and a serious expression. His presence alone made it clear that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Jaden sat up straighter. Something was definitely wrong. Ms. Holloway stopped beside their seats, her posture stiff, arms crossed. "Boys, we need you to come with us," she said, her tone clipped. Jaden's fingers tightened around the armrest. "Why?" Ms. Holloway exchanged a glance with Mr. Bennett before turning back to him. "There's been a mistake with your seating," she said. "You need to move." Jaden's heart pounded. "But we have first-class tickets," Malik said, his voice smaller this time. Mr. Bennett cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Boys, let's not make this difficult." Jaden took a deep breath, trying to keep his frustration in check. He knew arguing wouldn't help, but this wasn't right. "We didn't do anything wrong," he said, keeping his voice calm. "We checked in properly. We got our tickets scanned. We are in our assigned seats." Ms. Holloway's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your names weren't listed as first-class passengers when we reviewed the manifest." Jaden narrowed his eyes. "Did you check again?" For a split second, her hesitation gave her away. She hadn't checked. She had just assumed. But instead of admitting that, she squared her shoulders and said, "We'll resolve this at the gate. Please come with us." Jaden could feel Malik tense beside him. This was humiliating. They were being removed from their seats in front of everyone. Jaden glanced around. Some passengers stole glances. Others avoided looking entirely. No one spoke up. No one ever did. He exhaled sharply and grabbed his backpack. Malik hesitated before following his lead. As they stood, the energy in the cabin shifted. The first-class passengers who had previously ignored them were now watching closely. A businessman in seat 4A adjusted his glasses but said nothing. The woman in seat 3D frowned slightly but didn't intervene. Jaden and Malik walked toward the front of the plane, led by Ms. Holloway and Mr. Bennett. With every step, Jaden could feel the stares. The moment they stepped off the plane, a member of the ground staff, Lydia Patel, was already waiting near the gate. She glanced at them, then at the flight attendants. "What's going on?" she asked, her brows furrowing. Ms. Holloway crossed her arms. "There was a seating error. We need to confirm their reservation before we proceed." Lydia nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Jaden could tell she wasn't convinced either. As soon as they were seated near the gate, Malik pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. He typed out a quick message. "Malik, they made us leave our seats. They said there was a mistake, but we had our tickets." He hit send, his stomach twisting. A reply came almost instantly. "Dad, what flight number?" Jaden read the message and let out a slow breath. "He's going to be mad," he muttered. Malik nodded, gripping his phone tightly. "Really mad." Jaden sat stiffly in the stiff plastic chair near the gate, his fists clenched in frustration. He and Malik had been kicked out of their first-class seats, not because of a mistake, but because someone had decided they didn't belong there. Across from him, Malik was gripping his phone tightly, his leg bouncing anxiously. He wasn't just upset, he was humiliated. Jaden exhaled sharply, his mind replaying the way Vanessa Holloway had spoken to them. The way she had called for backup, the way she had doubted them from the start. She never actually checked. She just saw them sitting in first class and made a decision. She didn't even look at anyone else's ticket, Malik muttered, his voice low. Just ours. Jaden's jaw tightened. Because she already made up her mind. The flight attendants might think this was over, that they had handled the situation, but they had no idea what they had just done. Dad, stay where you are. I'm handling it. Malik read the message over Jaden's shoulder. She's in trouble, isn't she? Jaden smirked slightly. Yeah. She just doesn't know it yet. Vanessa walked back down the aisle, relieved that the problem had been removed from the cabin. She had done her job. She knew how these things went. People made mistakes with bookings all the time. Maybe the boys' parents had bought the tickets, or maybe there was an error in the system. Either way, first class was for premium passengers, and 2 unaccompanied teenagers didn't look like they belonged. She stopped beside Mr. Bennett, who gave her a firm nod. All taken care of? Vanessa smiled tightly. Handled. The businessman in seat 4 folded his newspaper. So, what was the issue? Were they in the wrong seats? Vanessa hesitated for half a second before answering. There was a misunderstanding, she said smoothly. We've corrected it. The man gave a polite nod and went back to reading. From seat 3D, an older woman in a navy blue blazer raised an eyebrow. She had been watching the entire thing. Did you check their tickets? She asked, her voice mild but sharp. Vanessa turned slightly. Excuse me? Their tickets. Did you actually check them before making them leave? The question caught her off guard. No one ever asked that. Vanessa forced another calm smile. Everything was handled appropriately, ma'am, she said before turning away. But her stomach twisted slightly, because she knew she hadn't checked. Up front, Captain Aldrich Vaughn was reviewing the final checklist before takeoff when the in-flight phone rang. He picked it up expecting a routine update, but the moment he heard the voice on the other end, his entire body tensed. Captain Vaughn, this is Dorian Vance, Executive Manager of Airline Operations. Aldrich immediately sat up straighter. Executives didn't call mid-flight preparations. Go ahead, sir, he said, already feeling the tension in his chest. Dorian's voice was calm but clipped. Did a flight attendant just remove 2 unaccompanied minors from first class? Aldrich's grip tightened on the receiver. He had been briefed about unaccompanied minors on this flight, but he hadn't heard about any seating issues. I wasn't aware of any removals, he admitted. There was a pause on the other end. Well, it happened, Dorian said, and you're going to want to fix it immediately. Aldrich's stomach dropped. Who was responsible? Senior Flight Attendant Vanessa Holloway. Aldrich closed his eyes briefly. Vanessa had been with the airline for years, experienced, professional. But she was also known for being unyielding. She enforced the rules with an iron grip. And now, she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Dorian didn't wait for him to respond. Captain, you need to be aware of something. Aldrich's stomach tightened. Those 2 boys, Dorian continued. Their last name is Carter, as in Desmond Carter, the CEO. The air left Aldrich's lungs. You're telling me. Dorian didn't let him finish. You have exactly 5 minutes to correct this before it escalates further. Get Holloway in line, now. Click, the line went dead. Aldrich exhaled slowly, then pressed the in-flight announcement button. A moment later, his voice came over the speakers, steady but firm. Miss Holloway, please report to the cockpit immediately. Vanessa froze in the middle of the aisle. Several passengers looked up. The announcement hadn't been made over the crew intercom. It had been broadcast to the entire plane. That never happened unless something was serious. Her stomach twisted. She turned toward the front, trying to keep her expression neutral, but a flicker of doubt crept into her mind. Had she just made a mistake? She squared her shoulders, brushing off the feeling. No, she had done her job. And yet, as she made her way to the cockpit, she couldn't ignore the quiet whispers spreading through first class. Passengers were talking, and for the first time in her career, she had a terrible feeling that she wasn't in control anymore. Jaden slumped into one of the stiff chairs at the gate, his fingers tightening around the straps of his backpack. Across from him, Malik sat with his arms crossed, his phone clutched tightly in his hands. The hum of the airport terminal buzzed around them, the sound of rolling suitcases, distant boarding announcements, and the murmur of conversations blending together. But for the 2 brothers, the world felt strangely quiet, almost like everything had paused the moment they were kicked off the plane. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Malik finally broke the silence, his voice low but sharp. She didn't even check, did she? Jaden shook his head, exhaling slowly. Nope. They had done nothing wrong. They had their tickets, their seats, and they had followed all the rules. And yet, Vanessa Holloway had taken one look at them and decided they didn't belong. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Malik huffed, his fingers moving rapidly over his phone screen. Zavan, they made us leave our seats. Said there was a mistake, but we had our tickets. He hit send, his stomach twisting. Seconds later, his phone vibrated with a response. Dad, what flight number? Jaden and Malik exchanged a look. She's in trouble, isn't she? Malik murmured. Jaden smirked slightly, unlocking his own phone and forwarding the flight details to their father. Oh yeah, she just doesn't know it yet. Vanessa Holloway walked back through the first-class cabin, feeling oddly satisfied with herself. Problem solved. She had removed 2 unaccompanied minors from first class, just like any good flight attendant would. They didn't belong in those seats. She knew that from the moment she saw them. It wasn't personal. It was about order. She passed a businessman in seat 4A who folded his newspaper and glanced up at her. So what was the issue? He asked casually. Vanessa gave him a polite but firm smile. Just a misunderstanding. Everything's taken care of. The man nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer. But from across the aisle, in seat 3D, an older woman in a navy blue blazer frowned slightly. Did you check their tickets? She asked, her voice mild but pointed. Vanessa blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? Their tickets. Did you actually check them before making them leave? For a moment, Vanessa hesitated. The woman wasn't asking loudly. She wasn't angry or accusatory. She was simply waiting for an answer. Vanessa smoothed her uniform. Everything was handled appropriately, ma'am, she said, and before the woman could press further, Vanessa turned and walked toward the front of the cabin. But the question lingered. Did you check their tickets? And for the first time, a flicker of doubt crept in. Jaden's foot tapped restlessly against the floor as he watched Malik's phone screen. Their dad was already typing. Dad, stay where you are. I'm handling it. Jaden exhaled slowly, leaning back against the cold plastic of the chair. Malik smirked. She really messed up, huh? Jaden nodded. Big time. The reality was sinking in now. Holloway had made a decision based on assumption, and she had humiliated them in front of an entire plane. She had walked them off the aircraft as if they had done something wrong without ever giving them a chance to explain. But she hadn't just done this to any passengers. She had done it to Desmond Carter's sons, the businessman, the CEO, the man who owned the very airline she worked for. And now, she was about to learn exactly who she had just humiliated. Jaden stretched his legs out, letting out a slow sigh. We don't have to do anything now, just wait. Malik nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Yeah, let's see how she likes it when she gets kicked out. Vanessa barely made it back to the galley before the in-flight phone rang. She picked it up, expecting a routine check-in. But the moment she heard the voice on the other end, her entire body stiffened. Miss Holloway, came a low, serious voice. This is Dorian Vance, Executive Manager of Airline Operations. Her grip tightened on the receiver. Executives did not call flight attendants before takeoff. Sir, she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. Dorian's tone remained calm but clipped. Did you remove 2 unaccompanied minors from first class just now? A strange feeling clawed at her stomach. Yes, sir. There was a seating issue. I handled it. A long silence. Then Dorian spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. Miss Holloway, those 2 boys are Desmond Carter's sons. Vanessa's blood turned to ice. The CEO's sons. The realization hit her like a freight train. Her breath caught in her throat. I wasn't aware of that. Dorian exhaled sharply. Clearly, but you should have been. The world around her seemed to blur. She felt like the floor had just dropped from beneath her. Miss Holloway, Dorian continued, you have exactly 5 minutes to correct your mistake before this escalates. Click. The line went dead. Vanessa stared at the phone in her hand, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had humiliated the wrong passengers, and now she was about to face the consequences. Captain Aldrich Vaughn adjusted his headset, his sharp blue eyes scanning the flight details on the monitor. Everything was set for takeoff, fuel levels, altitude settings, flight plan, all confirmed. He had flown thousands of flights in his career, and today was supposed to be just another routine journey. Until the phone rang. Aldrich reached for the receiver, expecting a minor issue from the cabin crew. But the moment he pressed it to his ear, he knew something was wrong. Captain Vaughn, a firm voice came through. This is Dorian Vance, Executive Manager of Airline Operations. We have a situation. Aldrich sat up straighter. Go ahead. Dorian's tone was controlled but clipped, like a man already deep in damage control. We just received a direct call from the CEO's office. 2 unaccompanied minors were removed from first class without proper verification. Aldrich frowned. What? He asked sharply. He knew there were unaccompanied minors on this flight, but he hadn't been informed of any seating issues. Who removed them? Dorian's answer was immediate. Flight attendant Vanessa Holloway. Aldrich swore under his breath. Vanessa had been with the airline for years. Strict, by the book, sometimes too rigid, but she was experienced. He trusted his crew to make the right calls, but something about this felt wrong. He exhaled. Did she check their tickets? Another brief silence. Then Dorian's voice came back, colder this time. No. Aldrich felt his jaw tighten. No verification, no confirmation. She just removed them. A creeping sense of unease settled over him. Something told him this wasn't just a seating mistake. Who are the minors? Aldrich asked. Dorian took a slow breath before delivering the blow. Jaden and Malik Carter. Aldrich froze. Every nerve in his body went rigid. The Carter boys, the sons of Desmond Carter, CEO and majority owner of the entire airline. Aldrich gripped the receiver tighter. Tell me you're joking. I wish I was, Dorian replied, voice grim. The CEO was informed immediately. He's already reviewing the situation personally. Aldrich inhaled sharply. This was a disaster. Mistreating any passenger was unacceptable. But removing the CEO's sons from first class, without verifying their tickets, without questioning the decision, that wasn't just a mistake. That was career-ending. And it was happening on his flight. Aldrich closed his eyes for a brief second, processing. The damage was already done. The only thing left was how they handled it. He exhaled through his nose, voice dropping to steely professionalism. What are our orders? Dorian's response was swift. Fix it, immediately. Aldrich nodded once, already making a decision. Vanessa had just made the biggest mistake of her career, and now she was about to face it. Aldrich set the phone down and turned to his CO pilot. Keep the plane on hold. We're not moving until this is sorted. Then, with a press of a button, he activated the overhead speaker system. A hush fell over the cabin as his voice echoed through the plane. Miss Holloway, report to the cockpit immediately. In the galley, Vanessa Holloway's heart skipped a beat. She had never been summoned to the cockpit before a flight. Not like this. Passengers noticed. Some exchanged glances. Others pretended not to listen. But the sudden announcement had clearly shifted the energy on board. From first class, seat 3D, the older woman who had questioned Vanessa earlier tilted her head slightly. She knew something was happening. Vanessa swallowed hard, forcing her shoulders back as she made her way toward the front of the plane. Her usual confidence wavered. This wasn't normal. She reached the cockpit door, knocked once, and waited. Come in. Aldrich's sharp voice came through immediately. She pushed open the door and froze. The air inside the cockpit was thick with tension. Captain Vaughn sat rigid in his seat, his eyes locked onto hers. The silence was suffocating. Vanessa had faced angry passengers, demanding executives, frustrated crew members. But nothing prepared her for this moment. Aldrich's voice was calm, too calm. Miss Holloway, she straightened. Sir? A pause. Then in a voice that cut like steel, do you have any idea what you've just done? Vanessa blinked. Sir, Aldrich held up a hand. No excuses, just answer me. Did you verify their tickets? Her mouth went dry. She hesitated. Too long. Aldrich's eyes narrowed. Yes or no? Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it. Then, finally, no. The word barely left her lips before the weight of the situation crashed down on her. She felt sick. Aldrich exhaled sharply. Miss Holloway, you removed Jaden and Malik Carter from first class. She blinked. The names hit her like a slap. No, that wasn't possible. But Aldrich kept going. You didn't check their tickets. You didn't verify with the gate agent. You didn't review the manifest. Her breathing shallowed. And now their father, the man who owns this airline, is demanding a full investigation. Vanessa's vision blurred. This couldn't be happening. She had been so sure, so confident. But she had humiliated the wrong passengers. And now, she was about to lose everything. The tension inside the cockpit was suffocating. Vanessa Holloway, once the most confident flight attendant on board, now stood frozen, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. The weight of Captain Aldrich Vaughn's words settled into her chest like a stone. She had made a terrible mistake. She had removed the wrong passengers. And now, the CEO of the airline himself was involved. Captain Vaughn didn't move, his expression unreadable. His CO pilot sat stiffly beside him, pretending to focus on the flight instruments. But it was clear, everyone in this cockpit knew what was about to happen. Vanessa's mouth went dry. Sir, Aldrich held up a hand, cutting her off. Miss Holloway, you are being removed from duty. She stiffened. Her mind raced. No, this can't be happening. She had worked for this airline for 15 years. She had given everything to this job. And now, over a simple misunderstanding? Her lips parted, desperate to explain, to defend herself. But Aldrich's voice was cold as steel. The executive office has already issued a directive. You are to step off this aircraft immediately. You will not be on this flight. You will not be part of this crew. And when we land, you will be escorted directly to the corporate office for a formal review." The words hit like a slap. She felt the blood drain from her face. Vanessa swallowed hard, trying to maintain some level of control. "Captain, I was just following my instincts. Aldrich's jaw tightened. "Instincts?" He let out a slow, disbelieving breath. "Your instincts humiliated 2 young passengers in front of a full cabin of first-class travelers. Your instincts made a snap judgment based on nothing but assumptions. And your instincts just brought the CEO of this airline onto this case personally." Vanessa clenched her fists. "I didn't know who they were." Aldrich's piercing gaze locked onto hers. "You shouldn't have needed to." Silence filled the cockpit. The realization of just how badly she had miscalculated settled deep into her bones. Then, before she could even process her next move, Aldrich reached for the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a slight delay. Thank you for your patience. Miss Holloway, please exit the aircraft immediately." Vanessa stepped back into the first-class cabin, her face burning. Passengers were watching. Some pretended not to care, but others, they knew. The woman in seat 3D had her arms crossed, eyes narrowed in silent judgment. The businessman in seat 4A adjusted his tie, shaking his head slightly. And then, there were them. Jaden and Malik Carter sat comfortably in their first-class seats, scrolling through their phones as if they had all the time in the world. But Vanessa knew. They weren't just relaxing, they were waiting for her to face the consequences. Jaden, the older of the two, lifted his gaze just briefly. His expression was unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Vanessa forced her feet forward. Her legs felt like lead. Every step toward the exit felt like a slow-motion nightmare. And then, she saw them. Standing just outside the aircraft door was Dorian Vance, the executive manager of airline operations. His presence alone was enough to confirm what she already knew. This was serious. He wasn't just here to observe. He was here to remove her. Her breath hitched. For the first time in her entire career, Vanessa Holloway was being pulled from a flight before it even took off. Dorian didn't say a word as she stepped off the plane. He just tilted his head toward the terminal. "Move." She swallowed the lump in her throat and walked. Behind her, the first-class cabin remained silent. But the damage was already done. Passengers weren't looking at her with respect anymore. They were looking at her like she was a cautionary tale. She had spent 15 years enforcing rules, keeping order, demanding respect. And now she was the one being escorted away like a problem to be dealt with. And the worst part? She had done this to herself. The moment she stepped off the jet bridge, the airport terminal felt different. Colder, as if the entire world had shifted while she was inside that aircraft. Dorian walked beside her, his pace measured. "Miss Holloway." His voice was calm, controlled, but unforgiving. She clenched her fists. "Sir, not here," he cut in. She froze. Dorian glanced around. Passengers and airport staff were nearby, watching. She followed his gaze and realized people were already talking. She could see it in their whispers. Some had heard what happened. Others had already pieced it together. The flight attendant just got kicked off her own plane. Vanessa's stomach twisted painfully. Dorian exhaled, shaking his head. "Let's go." She walked. She had no other choice. She wasn't the one giving orders anymore. The power had shifted, and she hated it. They reached a private elevator near the executive wing of the airport. Dorian tapped his ID badge. The door slid open. He stepped inside. Vanessa hesitated. Once she walked into that elevator, her fate was sealed. She inhaled deeply, then stepped inside. The doors closed behind her. The sound was final. Dorian didn't turn to look at her, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken warnings. "Miss Holloway." She clenched her fists. "Sir." Dorian's eyes flickered toward her just briefly, and then with an air of absolute certainty. He said the words that shattered everything she had built over the years. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." Vanessa Holloway sat in the dimly lit executive conference room, her back stiff, her hands clenched in her lap. The walls were lined with framed photographs of airline milestones, reminders of the company's legacy, a legacy she had just tainted. Across from her, Dorian Vance, the executive manager of airline operations, flipped through a thick folder with calm precision. His expression was unreadable, but his silence carried a weight that made Vanessa's skin prickle. Finally, he set the folder down and leaned back in his chair. "Miss Holloway, do you have any idea what you've done?" Vanessa opened her mouth but hesitated. What was she supposed to say? She had spent 15 years as a senior flight attendant, enforcing rules, making snap decisions, keeping order. And now, in a matter of minutes, she had gone from being respected to being escorted off her own plane like a problem passenger. She swallowed hard. Sir, I misjudged the situation. Dorian's sharp gaze locked onto hers. Misjudged? He repeated, his tone eerily calm. Miss Holloway, you didn't misjudge the situation. You misjudged 2 passengers. Her stomach twisted. He held up a hand. You didn't check the seating chart. You didn't confirm with the gate agent. You didn't follow standard protocol. Instead, you walked onto that plane, saw 2 unaccompanied young black boys in first class, and decided they didn't belong there. Vanessa flinched at his bluntness. I didn't intend, Dorian cut her off again. Intent doesn't matter, the result does. And now, because of you, we have an incident that's already making waves inside the company. Vanessa's pulse quickened. She knew things were bad, but how bad? Dorian sighed, rubbing his temple. You're lucky, Mr. Langford, she stiffened. Darius Langford, CEO, the man who built the airline from the ground up, the man whose sons she had just humiliated in front of an entire first-class cabin. Dorian's voice lowered. He didn't fire you on the spot. Vanessa's breath hitched. She had assumed that was already happening. She exhaled shakily. What does he want? Dorian leaned forward. You're going back. Vanessa froze. What? Dorian's expression didn't change. You're going back on that plane. You're going to walk down that aisle. And you are going to personally apologize to those boys in front of the entire first-class cabin. Her stomach plummeted. She had already faced humiliation once. Now she had to go back. She clenched her fists. Sir, with all due respect, Dorian's voice sharpened. Respect? You want to talk about respect? You didn't show those boys any. Now you're going to fix it. The room fell silent. Vanessa's breath came faster. This wasn't just about an apology. This was about reclaiming the respect she had lost. But deep down, she already knew there was no reclaiming it. The flight was still on the tarmac. As Vanessa stepped back onto the plane, she felt every pair of eyes turn toward her. The flight crew had heard everything. Passengers had witnessed everything. She was no longer in control. She forced herself to move. Her heart pounded. Her hands trembled. And then she saw them. Jaden and Malik sat comfortably in their first-class seats, their backpacks neatly tucked beside them. They weren't in a rush. They weren't flustered. They were waiting. Vanessa's pulse hammered. She took a deep breath and forced herself to walk forward. The silence in the cabin was thick. Passengers who had ignored her before were watching now. Some looked curious. Others looked judgmental. But one thing was clear. No one was on her side. She stopped in front of the boys. Her throat tightened. Her pride fought back. But she had no choice. She exhaled slowly and crouched slightly so they could hear her. There was a misunderstanding, she started, her voice forced but even. Jaden raised an eyebrow. Malik smirked. She knew immediately they weren't buying it. Jaden leaned back. A misunderstanding? He echoed. His voice wasn't angry. It was calm, measured, and somehow that was worse. Vanessa's fingers twitched. She knew what she had to do. She swallowed her pride. Her voice lowered. I was wrong. A flicker of emotion crossed Jaden's face. Malik tilted his head. For what, exactly? Vanessa's jaw tightened. For not verifying your tickets. For removing you from your seats without cause. The tension in the cabin shifted. Passengers listened carefully. Some nodded slightly. Others still watched with judgment. Jaden didn't blink. And? Vanessa inhaled deeply. And for assuming you didn't belong here. A silence stretched between them. Jaden studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. Malik smirked. Slightly. Vanessa waited. For what she didn't know. Judgment? Condemnation? But instead, Jaden leaned back, folded his arms, and simply said, Good. And just like that, it was done. As Vanessa turned, her hands clammy, she could feel the passengers still watching her. The woman in seat 3D gave her a small, knowing nod, not out of sympathy, but out of acknowledgement. The businessman in seat 4 let out a slow breath and shook his head. And then, just as she was about to retreat, Jaden spoke again. Miss Holloway. She paused, turned back slowly. Jaden's expression was unreadable. Next time, make sure your apology isn't because you got caught. The words hit like a slap. Vanessa felt the air leave her lungs. Passengers murmured. She couldn't respond. So she just nodded stiffly and walked away. Her nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. Vanessa Holloway sat stiffly in the back of a company-issued black sedan, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. The low hum of the car's engine filled the silence, but inside her mind, there was nothing but chaos. The flight was over. The apology had been made. But the nightmare? It was just beginning. Her phone buzzed again and again, each notification making her stomach churn. She knew what they were about. The whispers from passengers, the murmurs in the first-class cabin, the uneasy glances from her own crew. It had already begun. She reached for her phone hesitantly, her fingers icy as she unlocked the screen. And there it was, her name, plastered across news sites, social media, blogs. The first headline made her breath hitch: airline scandal. Flight attendant removes CEO's sons from first class over seating error. Another article: racial profiling at 30,000 feet? Airline under fire after first-class incident. And then the worst one: CEO Darius Langford responds to first-class controversy. No one should have to prove they belong where they already are. Vanessa's throat tightened. Her name wasn't in every article yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. She scrolled further, her heart pounding. Retweets, 20,000 plus likes, 50,000 plus comments. Exploding. Vanessa tapped on one of the trending hashtags. Hashtag first-class discrimination. Hashtag Langfordsons. Hashtag she didn't even check. The comments were brutal. She didn't even verify their tickets? Just walked up and assumed? Oh, she's done. Imagine kicking 2 kids off a plane in front of everyone, only to find out their dad owns the airline. I'd just disappear. Darius Langford didn't even have to yell. That's true power. She deserves whatever's coming. Vanessa's vision blurred. She had dealt with unhappy passengers before. She had been in high-pressure situations. But this was a public execution. At the same time, inside Langford Airlines corporate headquarters, a crisis management team was already in full motion. A group of executives, legal advisors, and PR specialists sat around a large oval table, some typing. Want to see firings, not just an investigation. What's the name of the flight attendant? We need answers. Vanessa stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Her name wasn't public yet, but it would be. And once it was, there was no coming back. She clutched her phone, her body trembling. Tomorrow, she would walk into that boardroom, facing a panel of executives, legal teams, and one man who held the power to decide her fate, Darius Langford. And she already knew she didn't stand a chance. The moment Vanessa Holloway stepped into Langford Airlines headquarters, she felt the weight of every single step pressing down on her. She was no longer in control. The polished marble floors, the modern glass walls, the distant hum of executives moving through the corridors. This was a place she had walked through confidently for the last 15 years. But today she wasn't an employee. She was an investigation. Vanessa sat stiffly in a cold, sterile waiting area just outside the executive boardroom. The silence was suffocating. Her hands clutched her phone, but she didn't dare check the notifications flooding in. She already knew what they would say. Every news outlet, every social media post, every passenger from that flight, they were all talking about her. She lifted her gaze to the frosted glass doors in front of her. Behind them, a panel of senior executives, legal advisors, and HR officials were preparing to decide her fate. And at the head of the table, Darius Langford, the man who owned the airline, the man whose son she had humiliated. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. This wasn't just about policy. This was personal. The doors swung open. A serious-looking assistant motioned her forward. Miss Holloway, they're ready for you. Vanessa stood, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She forced herself to walk forward, each step heavier than the last. As she entered the boardroom, she was immediately met with cold, unreadable gazes. A long glass table stretched out before her, lined with powerful figures. And at the end of the table, Darius Langford, calm, composed, unshaken. Take a seat, Miss Holloway. His voice was even, controlled, but beneath it, there was something undeniable. Power. Vanessa lowered herself into the chair, her fingers gripping the armrests. No one spoke at first. Then, Nathaniel Clark, the airline's director of operations, cleared his throat. Miss Holloway, we are here to discuss the events that took place on Flight 327. Do you understand the severity of this situation? Vanessa forced herself to nod. Yes, sir. Nathaniel slid a thick file across the table. It landed in front of her with a heavy thud. Inside, she already knew what she would find. Statements from passengers, official reports, screenshots of social media backlash, and worst of all, a transcript of her conversation with Elon and Zavon Langford. Darius leaned forward, his gaze sharp. Walk us through your decision-making process, Miss Holloway. Vanessa's throat tightened. I believe there had been a mistake with their seating, sir. Darius didn't blink. Did you check the manifest? She hesitated. No, sir. Did you confirm with the gate agent? A pause. No, sir. Darius let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. So you assumed? Vanessa felt the heat creeping up her neck. I was trying to maintain order in the first-class cabin. I made a call based on the situation. Nathaniel cut her off. You made a call based on an assumption, Miss Holloway, not protocol. Silence stretched across the room. Vanessa could feel it now, the walls closing in, the cold finality of the moment. She had spent her entire career believing she was the one enforcing the rules. But now she was the one being judged. After what felt like an eternity, Amara Wells, the airline's head of human resources, spoke. Effective immediately, Miss Holloway. You are placed on unpaid suspension pending further investigation. The words hit her like a slap. Vanessa's fingers curled into fists. Suspension? Her voice shook. She had expected disciplinary action, maybe even a demotion. But suspension? This is standard procedure given the public backlash, Amara continued, flipping through her notes. Nathaniel added, until we determine the full extent of this issue, you will not be permitted to work any flights, nor represent Langford Airlines in any capacity. Vanessa's breath came shallow. And what happens after the investigation? She forced herself to ask. Darius Langford was silent. Then, after a long moment, he simply said, we'll see. The words were calm, measured, but they held the weight of a death sentence. Vanessa felt her stomach drop. She had lost everything. Her authority, her position, her control, and maybe her entire career. The meeting ended with no handshakes, no words of encouragement, just silence. Vanessa stood, her legs trembling as she made her way toward the door. The moment she stepped outside, she felt every pair of eyes on her. The assistant at the reception desk, avoiding eye contact. The security guard by the elevators, expression tight. She was no longer Vanessa Holloway, respected senior flight attendant. She was Vanessa Holloway, the woman who got kicked off her own flight. She stepped into the elevator, the doors closing slowly. Her own reflection stared back at her in the mirrored walls. For the first time, she didn't recognize herself. The floor numbers ticked down, ground level. The doors slid open. She walked out into the world, and just like that, she was gone. Back at Langford Airlines HQ, the executive team remained seated. Nathaniel Clark turned toward Darius Langford. Do you think she'll survive this? Darius leaned back in his chair. His expression was calm, but his words? Sharp as a blade. That's not up to me, that's up to her. Vanessa Holloway sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, the weight of the last 24 hours, pressing down on her like an anchor. The suspension had been swift, too swift. One day, she had been a respected senior flight attendant, a woman who enforced order, controlled every situation, followed protocol without hesitation. And now, she was a headline, a name being whispered in every break room, a cautionary tale. She had spent the entire evening staring at her phone, scrolling through the endless waves of news articles, social media posts, and leaked footage from Flight 327. She had thought it would pass, that people would forget, but they hadn't. Her name was everywhere. And the worst part? She finally understood why. Vanessa pushed herself up from the couch, stepping into the small bathroom. The fluorescent light buzzed as she turned it on, casting a harsh glow against the white tiles. She stared at herself in the mirror. For the first time in 15 years, she didn't see the woman she once believed herself to be. She saw someone else. Someone who had spent years believing she was always right. Someone who thought following instincts was the same as following rules. Someone who had made one assumption too many. Her hands clenched the edge of the sink. Why had she done it? Why had she looked at those two boys and immediately assumed they didn't belong? She had told herself it was protocol, that it was about order. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had been uncomfortable. She had seen two young black boys in first class, alone. And instead of checking the manifest, confirming with the gate agent, or doing her job properly, she had just decided. A bitter taste filled her mouth. Her own reflection stared back at her, but for the first time. She didn't like what she saw. She closed her eyes. And suddenly, she was back on that flight. She could see the way Zavon's face had fallen when she accused them. The way Elon clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. The way the entire first-class cabin had watched in silence, too afraid or too indifferent to say anything. She could still hear her own voice, firm and unwavering. You need to come with us. She had been so sure of herself in that moment, so confident that she was doing the right thing. But she hadn't been right. She had been wrong. Horribly, undeniably wrong. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to relive every second of that moment. The moment she had humiliated two innocent kids for no reason other than her own bias. And for what? To feel powerful, to feel like she was keeping control of her cabin. What control did she even have now? She had lost everything. Her phone buzzed against the bathroom counter, snapping her out of the downward spiral. A new article notification. She hesitated before picking it up. Her stomach twisted as she read the headline, "No one should have to prove they belong where they already are." She didn't even need to open it. She knew exactly whose words those were. Darius Langford, the CEO, the father of the boys she had thrown off that flight, the man who had single-handedly dismantled her entire career in less than 24 hours. She had tried to convince herself that this was overblown, that she had just made a mistake. But looking at that headline, she knew. This wasn't just about two kids in first class. It was about every time she had looked at a passenger and made a silent judgment. Every time she had let bias, not policy, dictate her actions. Every time she had believed she was right without ever considering that she could be wrong. And now, for the first time in her life, she understood. Vanessa's hands trembled as she put down her phone. The excuses, the justifications she had been telling herself no longer worked. She couldn't blame the stress of the job. She couldn't blame the pressure of first class. She couldn't even blame the lack of information, because the truth was simple. She had seen two young black boys in first class and assumed they didn't belong. No verification, no second thought, just a choice. And that choice had ruined everything. She let out a shaky breath. She had always thought of herself as a good flight attendant, a professional, someone who upheld the airline's high standards. But now she wondered, had she been hurting people all along without ever realizing it? Vanessa slowly turned off the bathroom light, stepping back into the dark silence of her apartment. She had no idea what would happen next. Would she get fired? Would she ever be allowed to work in the airline industry again? Would anyone ever trust her in a position of power again? She didn't know, and for the first time, that terrified her. But there was one thing she did know. She couldn't undo what she had done. She couldn't erase the pain she had caused. She couldn't make this disappear. But maybe, just maybe, she could start learning. She could stop making excuses. She could finally see herself for who she really was, and change. She owed that to Elon and Zavon. She owed that to herself. And most of all, she owed it to every passenger she had ever judged without realizing it. For the first time in her life, Vanessa Holloway didn't just see a mistake. She saw herself. And for the first time in 15 years, she knew she had a lot to fix. Vanessa Holloway sat in the waiting area outside the airline's corporate office, her fingers intertwined so tightly that her knuckles turned white. This was it, her one chance, her only opportunity to make things right. The last 72 hours had been a blur of news articles, public outrage, and corporate silence. She had been suspended indefinitely, placed under internal review, and practically erased from the airline's official records. But somehow, some way, she had been given a meeting with Darius Langford himself. She had no idea why. She had no idea what he wanted to hear. But she knew one thing for certain. If she failed this meeting, her career would be over. The door to the conference room creaked open, and a sharply dressed assistant stepped out. "Mr. Langford will see you now." Vanessa swallowed hard, stood up, and stepped inside. Darius Langford sat at the head of the long glass conference table, his posture composed, his eyes piercing. Next to him sat two senior executives, their expressions unreadable. But it was his sons, Elon and Zavon, sitting just a few seats away, that made her stomach twist the most. She hadn't expected them to be here. They sat with calm confidence, their eyes locked on her, waiting to see if she would actually take responsibility. Darius folded his hands on the table. "Miss Holloway," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "Do you know why you're here?" Vanessa nodded slowly. "I assume it's to discuss what happened on Flight 327. Darius leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "No, that incident is already in the past. What matters now is what comes next." Vanessa hesitated. "What do you mean?" Darius exhaled, then gestured toward his sons. "Elon and Zavon asked me to give you a chance. Not because they forgive you." He shot them a look, and both boys remained silent, their expressions neutral. "But because they want to see if you can actually change." Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. A chance. They were offering her a chance. But for what? Darius tapped his fingers against the table. "I have a proposal for you, Miss Holloway. One that will determine whether or not you ever work in this industry again." Vanessa's heart pounded. "I'm listening." "You will participate in a company-wide initiative," Darius continued. "One that focuses on bias training, inclusivity, and retraining airline staff on fair treatment policies." Vanessa's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You want me to take a class?" Darius's gaze hardened. "No, Miss Holloway. I want you to teach it." Her breath caught in her throat. "Teach?" The room fell silent. For the first time since entering, Elon spoke. "You spent years enforcing rules, telling people where they did and didn't belong," he said, his voice calm but firm. Now, you'll use that experience to make sure no one else does what you did to us." Zavon crossed his arms. "Think of it as consequences with a purpose." Vanessa blinked. She had expected punishment, termination, a lawsuit, public humiliation, but this was something entirely different. Darius studied her reaction. "You will work under the direct supervision of our internal ethics board, travel to different flight crews across the country, and lead discussions on fair treatment in the airline industry." Vanessa's mind raced. She had never imagined herself in a position like this. But wasn't this exactly what she needed? A chance to prove, to herself and the world, that she could do better. That she wasn't the same person who had kicked 2 innocent boys off a plane without a second thought? Vanessa took a shaky breath. "And if I refuse?" Darius leaned forward. "Then we part ways permanently. No severance, no recommendation. And your name will remain attached to this incident forever." She swallowed hard. That wasn't a threat. That was a fact. She had already been the subject of a media firestorm. She knew how these things worked. No airline would ever hire her again. She'd be done, finished. But if she accepted, she could change. Not just for herself, but for every other flight attendant who needed to learn the lesson she had been forced to face. She exhaled slowly and met Darius Langford's eyes. "I'll do it." A beat of silence. Then, for the first time, Elon smirked. Zavon raised an eyebrow. "For real? That fast?" Vanessa nodded, her voice firmer now. "Because you're right. I let my assumptions define my actions, and it nearly destroyed me. If I can help stop others from making the same mistake, then I will." Darius studied her for a long moment. Then, he nodded. "Good." He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "Your contract will be revised to reflect your new role. You'll start immediately." Vanessa rose to her feet, her legs still slightly unsteady. This wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in days she felt something new. Hope. She turned to leave, but just before she stepped out, she heard Elon's voice behind her. "Miss Holloway." She turned. Elon's expression was unreadable. "Don't waste this opportunity." Vanessa held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small, determined nod. "I won't." And with that, she stepped out of the room, ready to start again. Melora Holloway sat in the dimly lit training room, the hum of the projector filling the silence. She had spent 15 years enforcing airline policies, but now she was on the other side of the table. A student. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just days ago, she had been a respected flight attendant. Now she was here, attending mandatory bias training, a requirement set by Darius Langford himself. Her punishment, or as he had called it, her opportunity. She folded her arms, shifting uncomfortably in her seat as the session began. "Good afternoon, everyone." The trainer, a sharp-eyed woman named Camille Torres, began. "Today we're going to address unconscious bias, how it affects our decisions, and, more importantly, how we can change the way we see the world." Melora stiffened. She wasn't sure she was ready for this. Camille clicked through a slide showing a row of passengers boarding a plane. "Let's start with a simple question," she said, glancing at the group. "When you see a passenger in first class, what's the first assumption that comes to mind?" Silence. A few of the attendees shifted in their seats. Melora's jaw tightened. Camille's eyes locked onto her. "What about you, Miss Holloway?" Melora's stomach twisted. She knew exactly where this was going. She hesitated, her voice quieter than usual. "I assume they're supposed to be there." Camille tilted her head. "Do you, or do you only assume that if they fit a certain profile?" A murmur rippled through the room. Melora's face burned. She knew why she was being singled out. She had made a snap judgment about 2 passengers on a flight. She hadn't checked the manifest. She hadn't questioned anyone else. She had just assumed, and she had been wrong. Camille let the silence stretch before she moved to the next slide, this time showing Elon and Zavon Langford sitting in first class. The room tensed. Melora's chest tightened. She recognized the image immediately. It was from the security footage that had been leaked to the press. The same footage that had turned her into a headline, a lesson in what not to do. Camille turned back to her. "Walk us through your thought process that day." Melora felt the weight of every eye in the room on her. For the first time, she couldn't defend herself. Because the truth was simple, she had judged them because of how they looked. She had spent 15 years believing she was just enforcing policies. But now, she was realizing she had been enforcing her own assumptions instead. Melora inhaled sharply. She could either deny it, pretend she hadn't made a mistake, or she could face it. "I assumed they didn't belong," she finally admitted, her voice quieter than usual. Camille nodded. "And why?" Melora swallowed. "Because they were young, traveling alone, and..." She hesitated, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. Because they didn't look like the passengers I usually see in first class. Camille didn't react. She just let Melora's words hang in the air. And for the first time, Melora truly understood the weight of her actions. She had never considered herself prejudiced. But bias wasn't always about hate. Sometimes it was about habit, a lifetime of assumptions, a split-second decision, and the consequences that followed. The training session continued, but Melora barely heard it. Her mind was racing. How many times had she done this before? Subtly questioned someone, treated them differently, doubted their place. And how many times had she gotten away with it because no one had challenged her? She had been lucky, but Elon and Zavon hadn't stayed silent, and now she was the one who had to learn. By the time the session ended, Melora felt exhausted, drained, like she had just been stripped down to her very core. She stood up slowly, ready to leave, when Camille called after her. "Miss Holloway." She turned. Camille's expression was unreadable. "Most people in your position would have walked out halfway through," she said. "You didn't." Melora frowned. "What does that mean?" Camille's lips curved into a slight smirk. "It means maybe, just maybe, you actually want to change." Melora wasn't sure how to respond. She had spent years believing she knew everything about this job. But now, she was realizing she had barely scratched the surface. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her skin. Her phone buzzed, a message from Darius Langford. "Session 1 complete. Let me know if you're actually learning something." Melora hesitated, then typed, "Back, I am." She stared at the screen for a moment longer before pressing send. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, she felt like she was finally waking up. Melora Holloway stood at the edge of the airport terminal, watching passengers come and go. The air smelled of coffee, jet fuel, and anticipation, a scent she had known for over 15 years. But today, everything felt different. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her fingers gripping the worn leather. Just a week ago, she had been escorted off a plane in disgrace. Now she was back, but not as the same person. She had spent the past several days in training sessions, facing difficult truths, questioning everything she thought she knew about fairness, bias, and the power she once held. She had assumed she would never step foot in an airport again, yet here she was, given a second chance. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she deserved it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. "Darius Langford." She exhaled before answering. "Ms. Holloway." His voice was even, controlled. "You're on time." She glanced at the clock. 8 a.m. sharp. "I know better than to be late for a meeting with you, Mr. Langford." A low hum came from the other end of the line. "Good. Come upstairs." The call ended. Melora hesitated, staring at her reflection in the glass doors of Langford Aviation's corporate office. She had spent years walking through airport terminals with confidence, knowing exactly where she belonged. Today, she wasn't sure at all. Inside, the receptionist greeted her with a polite nod before escorting her to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. Darius Langford stood by the window, dressed in his usual charcoal suit, his expression unreadable. Sitting across the table, Elon and Zavon. Melora stiffened. She hadn't expected them to be here. Zavon raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Elon sat with calm confidence, his gaze sharp. "Take a seat, Ms. Holloway," Darius said, motioning toward the empty chair. She obeyed. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Darius spoke. "You've completed the first phase of your training," he said, his voice measured. "I assume you've learned something." Melora met his gaze. "I've learned that my assumptions have consequences." Darius studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Good." He turned toward Elon and Zavon. "My sons also have something to say." Melora's stomach tightened. Zavon leaned forward, folding his arms. "You embarrassed us," he said bluntly. "You humiliated us. And if it weren't for our dad stepping in, you wouldn't have admitted what you did." Melora didn't look away. "I know." Zavon's eyes narrowed. "Why should we believe you've changed?" "A fair question." Melora inhaled. "You shouldn't," she admitted. "Not yet. Change isn't proven in words, it's proven over time." Elon finally spoke. "Then why are you here?" Melora glanced at Darius, then back at them. "I was told I had an opportunity," she said, carefully. "One that most people in my position wouldn't get." Zavon raised an eyebrow. "And you're actually taking it?" Melora's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. "I don't want my career back," she said finally. "I want to make sure no one else has to go through what you did." The room was silent. Darius tapped his fingers against the table before speaking. "We've been considering our options," he said. "Most people expected me to make an example out of you, to fire you publicly and move on." Melora braced herself. "But," he continued, "Elon and Zavon suggested something else." She blinked. "Wait, what?" Elon smirked. "We don't think firing you actually solves anything," he said. "We want you to help fix the problem. Melora's heart pounded. Darius nodded. Starting today, you'll be working in passenger advocacy and training, developing programs to ensure what happened on that flight never happens again. Melora's breath caught in her throat. She had expected punishment, not purpose. Hours later, Melora walked through the airport with a different perspective. She passed by first-class passengers, remembering the moment she had judged Elon and Zavon without a second thought. She passed by young travelers, realizing how often she had assumed they didn't belong. She passed by flight attendants, knowing that she had once been just like them, believing she had the right to decide who was welcome and who wasn't. And for the first time, she felt the weight of her own past mistakes. She had been given a choice to walk away, pretend she had learned, and disappear into the background, or to stay and actually make a difference. She had chosen the harder path, and maybe, just maybe, that meant she was finally on the right one. As we go through life, we often build our understanding of the world based on experiences, habits, and long-held beliefs. These beliefs shape the way we see people, the way we make decisions, and ultimately, the way we treat others. But what happens when our perspective is flawed? What if for years we have been making subtle yet impactful mistakes, unknowingly hurting others with assumptions and biases we never questioned? The story of Melora Holloway serves as a powerful lesson, not just about fairness, but about the importance of growth and accountability at any stage in life. Her actions on that flight were not the result of deliberate cruelty. They were the result of years of unchecked assumptions. She never stopped to question why she thought the way she did, until she was forced to face the consequences. This brings us to an important truth. Self-reflection is not something reserved for the young. It is something we must engage in throughout our lives, no matter how much experience we have. Wisdom does not come from age alone. It comes from the willingness to learn, to adapt, and to acknowledge when we are wrong. Many of us, especially those who have lived long lives, take great pride in our ability to judge character, to read people based on first impressions. But how often do we ask ourselves, am I truly seeing this person for who they are? Or am I seeing them through the lens of my own expectations? Melora's mistake was that she made a decision before seeking the truth. And isn't that something we've all done at some point? Maybe we've dismissed someone based on how they look, how they speak, or where they come from. Maybe we've assumed the worst about a young person, a stranger in a nice car, or a neighbor who doesn't act the way we expect them to. These assumptions, small as they seem, shape the world we create around us. One of the greatest lessons we can take from this story is that acknowledging our mistakes does not make us weak, it makes us stronger. When Melora realized the damage she had caused, she could have chosen to deny, deflect, or justify her actions. Instead, she faced her mistake head-on. That is true growth. And growth is something we are all capable of, no matter our age. This lesson is especially important in today's world, where change happens faster than ever. New generations bring new ideas, and sometimes it can feel as if the world is moving past us. But change isn't a threat, it's an opportunity. It's a chance to broaden our understanding, to connect with others in ways we never have before. The truth is, respect is not about status or age. It is about how we treat people, no matter who they are. Melora had spent years believing she was simply doing her job, when in reality, she had been making snap judgments that impacted real lives. It took losing everything for her to see the full weight of her choices. But here's the most important part. She chose to change. And that is what we must all be willing to do. No matter how many years we have lived, there is always more to learn, always room to grow. We can either cling to outdated perspectives, or we can embrace the idea that growth is a lifelong journey, one that makes us wiser, more compassionate, and more connected to the people around us. So the next time we find ourselves making an assumption, let's pause. Let's ask ourselves, do I really know the full story? Because sometimes, the hardest but most rewarding thing we can do is re-examine our own beliefs, and in doing so, open the door to a deeper understanding of the world and the people in it. If this story moved you, don't forget to take action. Like this video if you believe in fairness and accountability. Share it with your friends to spread the message. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful story. Your voice matters. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments below.